It all started on Christmas Eve, when I was in Nepal, and one day I decided to walk to the large statue of Shiva that could be seen from my terrace. According to Google Maps, it's about 10 kilometers, a 3-hour walk. It's a very touristy place where everyone goes in Pokhara. It's the Pundakat statue. As I walked there, I admit I was reflecting on the Holy Family of God and the mystique of Christmas. And after 3 hours of racking my brains over that topic, I arrived at the statue of Shiva. The first thing I saw next to the door was a second, smaller statue where Shiva was represented with his family, his wife Parvati, and his 2 sons Ganesha and Kartikeya. And then it happened. While I was walking, I heard Pope Francis on YouTube explaining the beauty of Jesus' Holy Family. He explained that it was an image that moved the devotee. The Holy Family of Jesus had left a deep impression on me because a few months earlier I had found an image of Jesus' Holy Family in the sand. Let me tell you the story so you understand. One day in Goa, I had a small crisis of faith between Christianity and returning to Krishna and the Hinduism I already knew. Krishna and Shiva are completely compatible with each other. Vaishnavas and Shaivists are compatible, and both are Hinduism. The important thing is not to stray from the heart of the matter. I was a Christian, but I still loved Krishna. Well, actually, my doubts at that time were whether to become a Protestant or a Catholic. So, at that time, I was really hesitating between becoming a Protestant or a Catholic. Only, you understand, being in India, with several of my conversations in Goa about Hinduism, well, I admit that after a whole night talking about Hinduism with a group of friends I had met, it's obvious that then that doubt had also arisen. What if instead of becoming Catholic or Protestant, what I had to do was embrace Hinduism? I still loved Christ, I still love him, but understand that I had that doubt back then. I needed to know what the right path was and how I should dedicate my life to God. And I wanted to clarify my personal ideas. And that day in Goa, I was on the beach and I said to myself, okay, I'm going to walk along the beach and I'm going to come across a religious symbol. Something, it doesn't matter, a pamphlet, a piece of graffiti, or a statue. Anything, but the next religious symbol I find on the beach is the religion I must embrace. And just as I thought that, my foot hit something metallic. I looked at the ground and saw a figurine. In fact, I show the figurine in a documentary that's one of the oldest videos on my channel. The video is called Jesus Mind, and there in Goa, when I found that Holy Family lying on the ground, I clearly saw it as a message. There are only 2 religions in the world that worship the Holy Family, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches. They are sisters and almost equal. And I grew up in Spain in a Catholic environment, so I understood that message to tell me to become Catholic. And a little later, I became Catholic. And thanks to the figurine of that Holy Family, I had begun to reflect on its mystique, the mystique of the Holy Family. And reflecting on that, while walking those 3 hours toward the statue of Shiva, I had heard on YouTube a simple but accurate explanation from Pope Francis about why the image of Jesus' Holy Family was so touching. And when I saw the statue of Shiva's family in Nepal, Pope Francis's words came back to me, and I saw the same beauty of Jesus' Holy Family in that family made up of Shiva, Parvati, Ganesha, and Kartikeya. It was the same beauty, it was the same explanation. And then I understood that the same love Catholics had for the Christmas nativity scene, the same feelings that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus provoked in us, was exactly the same feeling and emotion those Nepalese felt for Shiva's family. Until then, I couldn't understand why a god was represented with a family. I mean, I could understand that in Hinduism, Shiva represented God. But what I couldn't understand was what Shiva's family represented. I saw it as something mythological that distanced us from the representation of God on earth. Don't get me wrong, I believe Ganesha and Kartikeya are mythology. I just consider Shiva to be a correct way of worshiping God and Shaivism to be a serious religion to follow. Right now, from my Hinduism, I've embraced Shaivism, and I actually like Kartikeya, Ganesha, and Puja. I like the representation of Shiva's Holy Family, but what I want to say is that my religious beliefs are based on the one God. Regardless of what religion or what name is given to God, it doesn't matter. I see God in all religions. What I mean is that back then I could understand that the image of Shiva in Hinduism represented God, but what I couldn't understand was why Shiva was depicted with a family. It was something I disliked and a deterrent to accepting Shaivism as a religion. And yet, that day in Nepal, thanks to the words of Pope Francis, my heart softened before the image of Shiva with his family, and I found it beautiful. Since then, I have liked the image of Shiva with Parvati, Kartikeya, and Ganesha. I find it a very beautiful representation, and from the moment I accepted that I liked Shiva's family, the doors to my Hinduism and, more especially, to the figure of Shiva were reopened to me. So, to the question, why is God represented with a family? It's not because God has a family, God doesn't have a family, but it's a symbolic representation that evokes tenderness in us. It's no joke. I don't know if it was the pre-Christmas atmosphere, but at that moment I looked at Shiva's family and saw the same thing I saw when I looked at Jesus' holy family. In the Christian family, God is the Son. In the Shaivite family, God is the Father. It doesn't matter, it's the same thing. It's seeing God in the representation of familial tenderness, to move devotees in that symbolic representation where we see God loving like a family member. It represents the mercy of God himself and is a concession that must be made to his devotees to be moved by the image of a God loving like a father or like a son. I admit that I don't believe in Shiva's family as a literal family of living beings. I am a Hindu, and as a Hindu, I worship Parabrahman. For me, Brahman is the only thing that exists, although I don't define myself as dualist or non-dualist. And now that we're talking about dualism and non-dualism, I must say that this is an important issue because Shaivism is divided into two currents. I'll explain it to you, and then, if you're interested, you can choose the one you like best. One of the currents is non-dualism, that is, they say there is no distinction between God and the soul. The other current is dualism and says there is a difference between God and the soul. I honestly embrace both. For me, the nuance is that we are not God, but God is us. That is, I am not God, nor are you God, so, from the soul's point of view, reality is dual, and there is a division between the Jiva and the Ishwara. While, on the other hand, from God's point of view, since God is omnipotent and absolutely everything is God, therefore, from God's point of view, there is no difference in anything, absolutely everything is God. So, if we talk about the soul, I am a dualist and believe in the division of God and the soul, and if we talk about God, then I am a monist and believe that there is no division between God and anything, that everything is absolutely God, even us. But you be what you want, each person discovers God in his or her own way. I also believe that's what being Hindu is all about. Understanding that in Hinduism, God has many faces, and all are valid paths to reaching God. Pope Francis also once said that all religions lead to God, and he's right. Now, here I am speaking to you from a Hindu perspective about my personal relationship with God and how I came to know him through the figure of Shiva. I am a follower of God in all religions, but I have to be one. So now I embrace the path of Hinduism because I am a Hindu. And I must clarify that, as a Hindu, I believe that God is also Shiva. That is, when I pronounce the name Shiva, I don't do it in vain, rather, I believe I'm speaking of God. These are merely names and ways of worshiping God. And now I'm going to introduce you here to the beautiful relationship of love you can have with God through Shaivism and how I began to see God in Shiva. And about Shiva and that anecdote in Nepal. As you've seen, I had already had a relationship with Shiva, but it wasn't until that moment on that day in question, observing Shiva's family, that I truly accepted Shaivism. I mean, all the Hinduism in me was Krishnist, but it was at that time that my heart also opened to Shaivism. And it's been that day since I've loved Shaivism. And now I'm going to explain how mysticism has brought me closer to both Christianity and Hinduism, and I'm going to explain how Christian saints can bring us closer to Hinduism, and at the same time how Hindu saints can bring us closer to Christianity. Because the two are 100% compatible with each other. And for that, I'm going to talk about my spiritual conversion to God and my first mystical steps. Honestly, speaking of Christianity and Hinduism, this same anecdote has happened to me several times. For example, when I converted to Hinduism in Spain, I also converted to Christianity almost at the same time. I went on a trip where I traveled for 3 months as a wandering pilgrim. During those 3 months, I didn't believe in God, I believed in a kind of all and practiced Buddhism. But it was on that trip that I converted to God, and it's curious because at the same time I had Hindu mystical experiences, that trip was a journey of complete transformation toward Hinduism. But also on that trip, I had mystical experiences with Christianity, and it was a journey of complete transformation to Christianity. I'll explain that trip elsewhere, but it was a very powerful journey for me. And when I returned home, the first thing I did was read the Upanishads, and that's when I converted to Hinduism. And exactly 2 months later, I converted to Christianity. Honestly, I had a first year where I read Hinduism and Christianity interchangeably. During that time, I discovered the great Spanish mystics, such as Saint Teresa of Jesus, Saint John of the Cross, and Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and at the same time, I read several Indian yogis and saw that they said the same thing. In fact, when I read the Spanish mystics, I saw that they said exactly the same thing as Bhakti Yoga. In another chapter, I will talk about the connection between Saint Teresa of Jesus and her dwelling places of the soul with the mysticism surrounding Hanuman, and at the same time, I saw Christianity and Hinduism. It's simply that, in that first year of conversion, I became both a Hindu and a Christian. You could say that Hinduism led me to Christ, and you could say that Christianity led me to Krishna. Because in Spain, I was initially a Krishnist. In fact, I read the Bible and the Ramayana simultaneously, and I didn't distinguish between religions. I saw the same God in Hinduism and Christianity, but in two different cultures. And my heart was torn between the two religions. I didn't know if I was Hindu or Christian. For my characters, like Saint Teresa of Jesus, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, Saint John of the Cross, Saint Benedict of Nursia, Saint Augustine of Hippo, or Saint Francis, they were like the great bhakti yogis of the West, and, as a Hindu or Christian, I felt enormously attracted to them. For a long time, I practiced both religions as one and the same. The thing is, back then, I hadn't quite figured out my ideas and thought I had to choose between Christianity or Hinduism. I also wanted to dedicate myself to talking about God because that was my calling, and I found it difficult to talk to people about two religions at the same time. So later, even in Spain, I entered a phase of doubt about which path to choose. Honestly, I believed and still do believe in the divinity of Christ. I defend the mystery of Christ's incarnation and the virginity of Mary, so that fact was a major reason for the balance to tip in favor of Christianity. I also practice Bhakti Yoga, which is the path of devotion to God. In that sense, while Hinduism is divided into more forms of gods, there is a very rich pantheon with many names. On the other hand, Christianity is more focused on the worship of one God. And, furthermore, at that time I was nourished by both Protestantism and Catholicism. The truth is that at that time, Catholicism won the debate, and I found myself enormously drawn to Catholicism. In fact, even today, although many may not understand it, I also consider myself Catholic, which is why I wanted to dedicate myself to speaking about the great Catholic mystics, and I saw Catholic theology as a very well-founded and serious theology. Furthermore, it was the majority religion in my country, which is Spain, and I also wanted to reconnect with the roots of my country's spirituality. In that sense, as a mystic, I consider myself completely an apprentice of the great Spanish mystics. They are like my gurus, and for that very reason, between one thing and another, Catholicism won out for me at first. Furthermore, there was a time when I was hesitating between learning about Hinduism and Catholicism, and I got a job right across the street from a Catholic basilica. So every day people from the basilica would come into the building where I worked, and I would have many conversations with them about Jesus Christ. And let's say one thing, back then, I thought that if I spoke about Catholicism, many Catholics wouldn't understand that I also spoke about Hinduism. It goes without saying that Catholics normally adhere to the dogma of the Catholic Church, so, in an exercise of responsibility, I opted for Catholicism and became solely Catholic. And until not too long ago, I was solely Catholic and spent my days training in Catholic mysticism. But the truth is that God has challenged that reality and has shown me that honestly, one can be Catholic and Hindu at the same time without it being a problem. Both religions are paths to understanding the same God, and anyone can be enriched by both. In fact, my breaking point came at a time when I was already questioning my belonging to the Catholic Church. On the one hand, I wanted to remain faithful to it. I admired Christian mystics and wanted to be a Christian mystic and faithful to the Catholic Church, but on the other hand, I felt my path within the Catholic Church was stagnant. And then something happened to me. My brother always talked to me about Kabbalah, and I listened until one day I understood, and I swear to you that I also saw God in Kabbalah. In fact, I later wrote a book about Kabbalah that I'm going to upload. And of course, at that time, when I was spiritually stuck, when I discovered Kabbalah, I also saw Jesus Christ in Kabbalah, and I saw the Jewish tree of life as a praiseworthy path to understanding God. And all my schemes were broken, and I said to God, "Can't you now teach me that I can also understand God through the Jewish tree of life and at the same time ask me to stay in the Catholic Church?" You know what? There's a great forgotten Catholic mystic, Father Peter Yang. Peter Yang is a Chinese priest who lived in Spain and is one of the people responsible for bringing Taoism to the West. Peter Yang was 100% Catholic, and he explained that for him Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life, and that Taoism was the teachings on how to follow this path. Peter Yang opened the door to Chinese Taoism as a philosophy for me. On the other hand, it's well known that The Dwelling Places of the Soul by Saint Teresa of Avila, which is the book that converted me to Catholicism, is inspired by Muslim Sufi mysticism. That's a fact. The concept of the seven mansions and the inner castle is a completely Sufi concept, so Saint Teresa of Jesus must have learned it from the Muslim population in Spain and later Christianized it. And then in India, Catholic priests taught me the similarities between the mysticism of Saint John of the Cross and Hinduism. In fact, Saint John of the Cross was the most yogic of all the Spanish mystics. And regarding Saint Ignatius of Loyola was a great mystic who initially acted independently. It's true, he was Catholic, but until his period of asceticism in the Manresa cave and the writing of his spiritual exercises, Saint Ignatius of Loyola was a mystic who acted independently and practiced his Catholicism on his own. In fact, he had many problems with the Inquisition, and it was the church that told him that if he wanted to continue talking about mysticism, he had to first graduate in theology and moderate what he said. And that's the same lesson I draw from Saint Teresa of Avila. Once in Nepal, I read that Saint Teresa of Avila admitted that she had written a mystical book on the Psalms and that, because it was too daring for the Catholic Church, she had destroyed it. I also read that Saint John of the Cross was imprisoned by the Catholic Church, and that many of his mystical drawings were destroyed, and that for several centuries Saint John of the Cross fell into ostracism until, in later times, he was returned to the podium where he deserved to be. So, after discovering God through Jewish mysticism, I came to the conclusion that I was still Catholic, but that as a Catholic, I wasn't willing to censor mysticism. In theory, I'm no longer Catholic, I no longer practice, and I also have a relationship with God that's more Protestant. I don't believe in a God who will condemn me for not being Catholic. I believe that each person has their own personal path and that the essence of religion is to establish a personal relationship with God. Therefore, for me, all serious religions are valid when it comes to practicing our faith, and there isn't a single religion that exclusively holds the truth. Regardless, I continue to hold the Catholic Church in my heart and love it. I grew up in a Catholic family and school. I've had a very beautiful relationship with the Catholic Church, and I believe many Catholic priests are very serious men of God. I also believe the Catholic religion has a very serious theology, although I don't currently agree with everything they say. Furthermore, I continue to consider the great Catholic saints as role models and great inspirations for me, and I share the Catholic concept of aspiring to holiness. That foundation that every Catholic has of aspiring to be holy is the perfect foundation for Bhakti Yoga. Therefore, all my respect to the Catholic Church. But honestly, as I've said, I consider myself a disciple of the great Spanish mystics. In my personal ego, I would like to pass myself off as a Spanish mystic who was a successor to the Spanish mystics, and in that sense, I consider myself completely indebted to figures like Saint Teresa of Jesus, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, or Saint John of the Cross. What happens to me is that I've realized that I follow the God of these Spanish mystics, not the institution that censored them. In other words, I follow the God of the Book of Psalms that Saint Teresa of Jesus destroyed because it was too daring for the Catholic Church. I follow the God of the lost drawings of Saint John of the Cross, And I follow the God with whom St. John of the Cross connected while repeating the Psalm of Songs on repeat when the Catholic Church had locked him in a dungeon for being too mystical. I follow the God that St. Ignatius of Loyola saw in his asceticism in the Manresa cave, but I no longer follow the institution that forced him to censor himself to conform to the purely Catholic message. And I follow the God that Father Peter Yang saw as a Catholic priest who practiced Taoism and taught Taoism. Yang saw himself as a Catholic priest who practiced Taoism and taught Taoism. In other words, I've come to the conclusion that, although I respect the Catholic Church, I no longer follow the Catholic Church, and I'm no longer going to censor myself as a mystic to conform to the dogma of an institution. My loyalty to the Church is paramount, even if I have to practice it from a Protestant perspective and individually, even if the majority of Catholics will never respect what I said, or even if the Catholic Church doesn't like my content. It doesn't matter to me. In my thesis, I am a pure Catholic faithful to Catholic mysticism. The thing is, as a Catholic, I follow the God of mystics like Saint Teresa of Jesus, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, or Saint John of the Cross, but I no longer follow the antiquated institution that didn't understand them and persecuted them and forced them to moderate themselves. And as I follow the God of the Christian mystics, I also follow the God of the Sufi mystics, whom Saint Teresa of Avila drew inspiration from to write the Mansions of the Soul, which converted me to Catholicism. And as I follow the God of the mystics, I also follow the God of the Jewish mystics, who rack their brains studying the mystical secrets of God in their highly complicated science. And as I follow the God of the mystics, I also follow the God of the Greek philosophers, who are precursors of Christian thought and mysticism, and who, in their thesis, were pure intellectual mystics. And as I follow the God of the mystics, I obviously also follow the God of the Hindu mystics, whom I love so much and who were the ones who first brought me closer to God. And it is from that mysticism that loves God, and it is from that belief in the God of the mystics that I now, in this new stage, am returning to Hinduism and embracing Hinduism in a new rebirth where what I seek first and foremost is a direct connection with God. But why Hinduism? For three personal reasons that I hope will serve as food for thought. First of all, because I love it. Religion is a personal journey where each individual follows their own personal relationship with God, and for me, that journey began with Hinduism, so God has led me to love Hinduism. The second reason is because Hinduism is the only religion that allows me to believe in other religions. Hinduism is devoid of dogma, and while in theory it's frowned upon for a Christian to be Hindu, it's not frowned upon for a Hindu to speak of Christ, so Hinduism allows me to also be a Christian. Because I am also a Christian. And the third reason is because, in my opinion, Hinduism is the religion that gives the most space to mysticism. Hinduism is the least dogmatic religion and the one that places the greatest emphasis on mystical practices. Consider yoga, tantra, meditation, puja, or the great Indian philosophy. All are great methods of mysticism and paths that Hinduism offers us to follow on our particular spiritual journey. So, for me personally, I currently see Hinduism as the realm of mystics, and it's the religion in which a mystic feels most comfortable. And also because the concept of bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion as practiced in Hinduism, has completely permeated me. It's a mysticism that perfectly defines my own mysticism. What I practice is bhakti yoga in its purest form. And besides, today, Hinduism's theology of Brahman is the one that most convinces me as a divine revelation. It's through Hinduism that I know how to explain God. So Hinduism as a practice has completely permeated me. It is through Hinduism that I now travel a new path of devotion to God, and it is from Hinduism that I will now return to learning about and loving the great Catholic saints. And finally, I want to share one last anecdote about my experience in India. It's not about Shaivism, but about the Vaishnavas, but it's the same. It doesn't matter if it's Shiva, Vishnu, or Krishna, it's all the same Hinduism in different forms. I'm now approaching it from Shaivism. However, I also recommend that you learn about the other currents because they are also very rich and completely complementary. But something very significant happened to me while I was spending 3 months in Tamil Nadu, in southern India. I was living in Chennai at the time, and there were 2 Catholic churches near where I lived. One church was dedicated to St. Francis Xavier and a second church dedicated to St. Anthony of Padua. It was this second church of St. Anthony of Padua that I happened upon one day when they were celebrating, and it was packed with people. I spent a long time in the church and walked around it several times. And do you know what I saw? That the Catholic devotees in India were worshiping a blue baby Jesus. It's no joke. In that Catholic church, which I also saw was a center for interfaith connections, right in front of the main door of the temple, Jesus was represented as a blue baby. That blue baby is Krishna, and Krishna is the representation of God through which I fell in love with Hinduism. And Krishna is the Hinduism that, in that early stage as a believer, made it possible for me to embrace both religions. I mean, I loved Christ through Krishna, that's the truth, and loving Christ led me to love Krishna. And when I saw that those Catholics in Chennai loved Christ through Krishna, I started laughing and understood that those Catholics had understood everything. I have one last question for you. If I talk to you about a God who became a baby and was born from a woman's womb, am I talking about Christ or Krishna? Both gods represent the same God. The mythological stories of Krishna also tell us about an incarnate God who was born through a virgin and who walks within us. So, to worship the blue baby that Krishna represents as Christ is to have understood everything. And that's why I consider myself both Hindu and Christian at the same time, because they both follow the same God. And the same Rama I fell in love with is the same Christ I love, and the same Krishna I fell in love with is the same Christ I love. And loving Christ and the saints who loved Christ has led me to love even more strongly the avatars of God, Krishna and Rama. And the same Shiva that I love is, for me, the same YHWH that I love. So, for me, there is no difference between the Abrahamic God and the Hindu God. They are the same God expressed in two different religions. And that is why I do not see it as incompatible to love Christ and at the same time consider myself a Hindu. And this is my letter about why, even in my Hinduism, I still love the Catholic Church, and this is my letter about how, by loving Shiva, I love Jesus, and how following the Christian saints is following the God of the great Hindu saints, and how following the God of the great Hindu saints is following the God of the great Catholic saints. And that's why I love God in all his faces, names, and expressions, because God is always one. And you can see the same love and tenderness in both the image of the Holy Family of Jesus and the image of the Holy Family of Shiva. And you can see the child God in both the Holy Child Jesus and the image of the Holy Child Krishna. And this is my letter about why, even in my Hinduism, I still love the Catholic Church, and this is my letter about how, by loving Shiva, I love Jesus, and how following the Christian saints is following the God of the great Hindu saints, and how following the God of the great Hindu saints is following the God of the great Catholic saints. And that's why I love God in all his faces, names, and expressions, because God is always one. And you can see the same love and tenderness in both the image of the Holy Family of Jesus and the image of the Holy Family of Shiva. And you can see the child God in both the Holy Child Jesus and the image of the Holy Child Krishna. But God, in his thesis, is one and always the same, a single, living and true God who can be known through all religious traditions, the God of the mystics who sought their personal connection with God. All the mystics of all religions say the same thing about God, but with different explanations and words, and that is the God I love, the God of the mystics. And that is why it is 100% compatible to love Christ and at the same time love Shiva as God, because my conclusion is that both represent the same and unique truth expressed in two different ways. And you are free to choose the path that you think brings you closer to God. And that's why being Catholic and Hindu at the same time is 100% compatible. Glory to God. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. There's much more content on the channel.